My remarks will be the reset in U.S.-Russian relations. This is a good time to broach that topic because it's been about a year since the term was coined, and it's perfectly appropriate that we take a look at what has resulted from this new policy, which implicitly and even explicitly suggested that the fault in the fault for the tension in U.S.-Russian relations lay with the U.S. After all, why should the United States reset its policy if its policy was worthwhile to begin with? And this was picked up very much by the Russians. I was on an interview program on Arabic Al Jazeera with a Russian representative who was able, before an Arab audience, to be considerably less tactful than he would have been if he had been before an audience that composed of Westerners. And he said, this is clearly an admission on the part of the United States that they've hopelessly ruined U.S.-Russian relations. Doesn't imply on any need for concessions on our part. Let them correct their mistakes. And as a result of that, the situation will improve because we haven't done anything wrong to begin with. Well, the rationale for this change in policy, which was announced by Vice President Biden at the Munich Security Conference, was that we need Russia's help, that in fact none of the major problems in international relations can be solved without the cooperation of Russia. And there are three areas that are frequently mentioned: relations with Iran and Iran's attempts to gain nuclear weapons, nuclear arms reduction talks, and in addition, the supply of our troops in Afghanistan. Well, in all cases, the situation as a result of the reset in relations has not improved, and in some respects has even gotten worse. As far as the relations with Iran are concerned, there have been three United Nations resolutions in which sanctions of a sort were mandated for Iran. All of those sanctions were little more than slaps on the wrist as a result of intensive efforts by Russia and China to dilute any meaningful measures vis-a-vis Iran. Has there been a change since then? Actually, no. What there has been a kind of rhetorical game that's been played on the part of the Russian leaders, in which, on the one hand, the president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, says that Iran has gone too far. He bangs the table and says that we can't put up with this anymore. We're ready to consider sanctions. And then Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, replies that actually Iran is being perfectly cooperative and we don't see any reason why any change should be inaugurated. And as a result, the situation remains what it was. Russians continue to provide black market aid and advice to Iran, as well as diplomatic coverage, and Iran continues in its efforts to make nuclear weapons and to become an even greater threat to the world than it is already. The situation is similar with the nuclear arms reduction talks. The last START treaty expired in December. There was a hope expressed by the Obama administration that it would be possible to have a new treaty in place before the expiration of the old one. Well, that didn't happen. Negotiations are continuing. But the greater question, and the more pivotal one from the point of view of the national security of the United States, is whether we need such a treaty at all. Russian nuclear experts and independent defense analysts have affirmed that Russia will not, as a result of the envisaged treaties, be retiring a single workable nuclear weapon. They will be retiring those weapons which will be going out of, which have no service life. Whereas the United States, in response, will be forced to make real cuts. Well, it's not inconceivable that even such a seemingly one-sided agreement could be in the interests of the United States. But what is really disquieting are the justifications that are used for this agreement. The idea that we're paving the way for a world without nuclear weapons, which is unrealistic under circumstances in which Iran and North Korea are frantically trying to develop them, on the one hand, and unrealistic in a situation in which Russia, our supposed partner, not only has no plans to eliminate nuclear weapons, but makes nuclear weapons the absolute linchpin of its security policy and is lowering the threshold for their use. The other justification is that this will establish that we respect Russia, that we recognize Russia as a great power, which raises the question of why we should do such a thing. Is it really important in our defense planning that we encourage Russia psychologically to think that it's something that it's not? And what are the likely consequences of this misperception on the part of Russia? We've seen that Russia has a proclivity for attacking its neighbors and putting pressure on them. We need only refer to the war in Georgia in August 2008. Russia is building, establishing new military bases in Abkhazia, an area that it in effect separated from Georgia, a sovereign nation, while shortly after waging really a genocidal war to prevent separation on the part of Chechnya from Russia. So it's hard to see in the case of strategic arms reduction talks either that the reset has brought any meaningful benefit to the United States. President Medvedev did announce, and in this respect, his announcement has been backed up by action, that goods intended, including lethal cargoes, intended for Afghanistan can now transit Russia. But here again, there's a paradox, because we have to ask ourselves, why in heaven's name should Russia have ever refused cooperation in our efforts to remove a grave threat to the world, but in particular to Russian national security posed by Islamic extremists in Afghanistan? Is this not a case of creating a problem in order to resolve it and then take credit for the resolution? In addition to these strategic issues, an unannounced but nonetheless important consequence of the reset has been silence on the part of the United States regarding human rights violations in Russia, the dismantling of democracy, the killing of human rights activists and journalists who dare to publish truthful articles. This process is continuing in Russia, and with no end in sight. There's not mass terror in Russia. There's not even mass repression. There's a level of freedom that, to be fair, is far greater than anything that existed under the Soviet Union. But there's selective terror. And that those people who, as a matter of principle, seek to oppose the authoritarian practices of the regime are eliminated one by one. And this tendency cripples, because it engenders fear, it cripples the capacity of Russian society, which is battered under any circumstances by the impact of years of economic turmoil, to assert its rights against a regime which is seeking to become permanent with a president for life. I know some will object that there's a new president, Dmitry Medvedev, but in fact the new president is controlled by the old president, so we can really speak of Russia being ruled by a president for life. So the scorecard in the end for the change in policy, which was supposed to create a new, more cooperative Russia, is extremely discouraging. There's little benefit that the United States has gained from admitting to mistakes that it never made, and the long-term effect may well be not to charm the Russians, but in fact to embolden them to act as they have in the past in ways that are contrary to American interests. Russian objections to American activities in Ukraine were not based on any real fear of independence, of interference, rather, or any legitimate desire to respect the rights of Ukrainians. The election, the most recent election shows, I mean, among other things, that there's a workable system, a workable democratic system in Ukraine. So from, with our way of thinking, we could say to the Russians, look, you were wrong. Your guy, he was defeated in the Orange Revolution, but nonetheless, there's a system of democracy. Now he's back in power, and this is the nature of democracy, that when you lose power, you can still fight to get it back. That argument would make sense if you were talking to a different group of people. But the Russians, are, to the extent that they think about these things, the Russian leaders, they're not concerned whether it's a demonstration of that democracy works or doesn't work. They're concerned that Ukraine is not completely controllable by them. And as long as the United States stands behind a process which will make that difficult, that will be a source of tension. And if there are no obvious ways in which to stir up that tension, they'll invent some. Iran is a country with a very young population. Russia has an aging population. And the day will come when the demographic balance between those two countries will be considerably less favorable to Russia than it is now, and that day will be soon. Russia has every reason to be concerned about a nuclear weapon in the hands of fanatical and bloodthirsty Iranian clerics. But they also understand another thing, which is that by backing Iran, by providing diplomatic cover, by facilitating contacts, which have the inevitable result that money and black market expertise flows from Russia to Iran, they make themselves important in world affairs. If Russia were cooperating with the West, there would be no reason for the Western countries to be spending huge amounts of mental energy trying to come up with ways to influence Russia to do what it's supposed to do in the first place. And by making itself a problem and then holding out the possibility that maybe it will help a little bit with the solution, it creates a situation in which Russia's profile and influence in world affairs, albeit in a negative sense, is greatly heightened. And that's something they don't want to give up. And the national interests of Russia are not identical to the selfish interests of the small group of people who run the country. And therefore, it is this small group which is incompatible with integration with the West, which inevitably raises questions about human rights, rule of law, decent behavior, and the like, as well as democracy. You can't have a president for life in a country that's an integral part of the Western alliance. And so therefore, to preserve this kind of oligarchic structure of power, this corrupt and aggressive regime, it's really necessary to seek not points of contact with the West, but points of conflict. And that's what they do. So that there's a tradition in Russia of lack of respect for the individual, and that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. Communism built on that, as did the Tsarist regime. And only really by establishing once and for all that the individual human being has some inherent worth, and making that really the foundation stone of the whole social structure, can the problem of values in Russia really be solved. And there's another question I think that's implied by your first question, which is, well, why is it in general that Russia doesn't seek to become part of the West, given the fact that there's so many advantages economically, spiritually, psychologically, politically for the Russian people, and geopolitically and militarily from such an alignment? Is not Russia a natural partner of the United States, bearing in mind the developing power of China? And the answer is very simple, and that is that the...
We had a question over here. Oh. You got it answered? Okay. Another one on the right. Yeah, go ahead, please.
How could Russia... Well, after the collapse of communism, there were many countries between NATO and Russia that were not in NATO. That was a process that took place over many years. But it wasn't a mistake because Russia is an inappropriate member of NATO, both by virtue of its undemocratic internal structure and because of its geopolitical positioning. The NATO really has little to gain from guaranteeing Russia's border with China, and Russia has, and in any case, the whole psychology of Russia it is conceivable. The idea of a NATO-Russia alliance or partnership is perfectly plausible, and that was attempted. And it is being attempted. There is a NATO-Russia Council, albeit one that doesn't function very well or very effectively. But for Russia to become a member of NATO in the full sense, it would have to thoroughly adopt Western values. And the adoption of those values would have to come first, rather than admission to NATO coming first and the values coming later. It reminds me again of an anecdote, but I'll keep it brief. When I grew up in Chicago, and there was a street gang in my neighborhood called the Blackstone Rangers. And Congress, in its wisdom, decided to give the Blackstone Rangers, who are the most murderous street gang in Chicago, an economic opportunity grant. So then we had on the streets of Chicago this street gang administering this federal grant at the same time as they were killing anyone who didn't join their gang. So this is just a case in point of the dangers of putting the cart before the